Joining me now, William Shawcross. The book, again, is called Deliver Us from Evil, Peacekeepers, Warlords, and a World of Endless Conflict. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Tell me what's the thesis here? I mean, it's really all about Kofi Annan, and it's all about peacekeeping. I mean, tell me why you wrote it and what's the thesis?
It's looking at the way the world has exploded after the end of the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall came down, we thought it was going to be heaven on earth, and it wasn't exclusively. It's better for most people that communism ended, obviously. But all these little conflicts all over the world, which had been kept suppressed by the Cold War, exploded.
Yugoslavia being the best example.
Yugoslavia being the best example. And this looks at how the world deals with, how the Western world, the international community, which is led by the United States, how we deal with disasters in other countries, where we can intervene, where we can't. For example, there's been recently the Chechnya assault by Russia. We have made words, we've said, oh, we shouldn't do it, but we haven't intervened. We wouldn't dare intervene with Russia. We cannot. But that doesn't mean to say we can't intervene in other places.
Yeah, but see, immediately what it says, I mean, I want to keep this, you know, there are two kinds of peacekeepers here. I mean, you've got one, the United Nations and Security Council, and clearly there you had Bosnia. Yeah. Kosovo had nothing much to do with the United Nations. It had only to do with NATO in terms of intervening. Then UN comes in later. Right. I'm telling you everything you obviously know.
Well, that's interesting. You're quite right to make that difference. The UN cannot make war. And one of the problems the UN had in Bosnia is that it was sent in by the Security Council into a war where there was no peace to keep. The UN has peacekeepers, but they cannot go into a war zone. When they went to Cambodia, where I was, and watched the election take place there in 1993, there was a peace agreement, and they could enforce that or try to monitor and police it. In Bosnia, it was a complete free-for-all with Serbs killing Muslims, Croats killing Serbs, and so on. It was a horror story, and the UN got bogged down in the middle, you know, had soldiers from France and Britain and other countries just watching murders taking place and being in a horrible situation.
No one, I mean, I've had this conversation with him, both at the Council of Foreign Relations, where you were, in front of an audience with the Secretary General. I mean, he was not pleased about what happened in Kosovo in terms of it in a sense, eclipsing functions of the United Nations. What did Kosovo do to the role of the United Nations as the world's quasi-policeman?
Well, the United Nations can't be the world's policeman. The United States is sometimes talked of as the world's policeman. The United Nations can only keep and try and administer peace. Kosovo is very important because what happened was the Security Council was set aside. The United States and NATO, the NATO powers, knew that if they went to the Security Council to ask for authority to bomb Kosovo, the Russians and the Chinese would veto it. So what they did was NATO did it on its own. And then having won the war in the sense of expelling Serbian troops from Kosovo, they then said to the United Nations, right, now you build the peace. And now this is one of the problems because interest flags, our attention moves on. The CNN factor pulls us away. And Kosovo isn't now getting the attention that it deserves. And, for example, the UN administrator in charge of Kosovo has asked for 6,000 policemen to run the place, international police. He's got 2,000 so far. And it's a bit of a lawless zone. But, you know, that's the trouble with peacekeeping. You think international police, fine, but then you think, where are they going to come from? Are they going to be New York's finest? Are they going to come from Des Moines, Iowa? Are they going to come from London? Where do you find 4,000 policemen quickly? Not easy.
Does the world, I'm shifting gears, want the United States to be the world's policeman? Does the world want NATO to be the world's policeman? And when I say the world, who are we talking about? Obviously, the Chinese were not thrilled about what happened in Kosovo because of fears that they have that somehow someone else might invade there.
Well, the Chinese don't like
sovereignty and integrity.
Absolutely, and this is the big issue now. How far is traditional sovereignty, which we have all paid lip service to, and more than lip service, it should be said, how far is it going to be infringed by humanitarian causes? And Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has made speeches saying that humanitarianism is much more important now, and Clinton has done the same. And in Kosovo, that was clear. We made war in a sovereign country, Yugoslavia, with which we were not actually technically at war, for a humanitarian cause. We can't do that everywhere. We can't do it in Chechnya because the Russians are too powerful and too important. We can't do it on behalf of Tibetans in China.
Because the Chinese are too important. And
the Chinese are too important.
Okay,
exactly.
So when should we do it? And we didn't do it in Africa.
No, but that's a good point, because, and Kofi Annan himself has pointed out, that if there had been a coalition of the willing of African states which had been willing and able to intervene in Rwanda to stop the terrible genocide there in 1994, and had done this without Security Council approval, we probably would have said, well done. Because there's a great anguish at the United Nations and elsewhere now that genocide in 1994, when 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda in the space of something like 60 days. Unbelievable rate of killing. We couldn't stop it.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the interesting thing about me. I mean, when you think about this circumstance, the notion here is deliver us from evil, peacekeepers, warlords, and a world of endless conflict. If the kinds of conflict that are going to mark the new century are those that were at the end of the last century, which is, in a sense, ethnic conflicts and all kinds of within states. Yeah. If that's the kind of conflict, Africa does not lend itself to the kind of bombing that took place in Serbia.
No.
And are the citizens of the United States going to be prepared to see American soldiers die on peacekeeping missions in Africa?
No, they're not. And there are no American soldiers on peacekeeping missions in Africa or anywhere else now.
Yeah, but there were American soldiers that were flying in Kosovo.
Yes.
And against the Serbs.
Against the Serbs, flying as safely.
They didn't get shot down.
They was flying as safely as was possible, only up to as low as 15,000 feet in order to protect them. And no American serviceman or anybody else from NATO was killed in combat. It was a bloodless war. But this is another factor that comes into this, the fact that now in the United States, to a lesser extent in Western Europe, there is this feeling amongst politicians, particularly in the Clinton administration, that you cannot suffer casualties in these sorts of missions. And that's a very difficult paradox for the United States as the only superpower not really being prepared to display its power in an effective military way when necessary. And that's a problem. But in Congo, for example, in Africa, a new peacekeeping mission is just being mounted. And imagine how hard it is. In Congo, there are 14 countries all at war around Congo and within its edges. And Congo is the size of Western Europe, or the size of 200 Kosovos, and no roads, no structure, no infrastructure, nothing. And so but the African countries have asked the Security Council, pushed the Security Council to authorize a peacekeeping mission, because they say, you do Kosovo, you do East Timor, what's wrong with Africa? So they are mounting a peacekeeping mission, and they're going to send 500 monitors with 5,000 troops to protect the monitors.
Where are the troops coming from?
They haven't found them all yet. They'll probably come from, mostly from African and Asian countries. Most peacekeepers come from poor countries whose governments like to have them.
But in
East
East Timor, they came from Australia.
East Timor was very lucky that it was next to Australia, because there you have a highly developed industrial country with a very serious interest in East Timor, that it didn't want East Timor to explode and Indonesia to explode. They could move in quickly.
Tell me what you think the rules are for the future.
The rules for the future are very hard to discern, but I think that this kind of humanitarian intervention will carry on being made, and what has to be, it'll be made where it's possible to make it. You have to be pragmatic, and being pragmatic isn't necessarily being cynical. You can help in some countries. You can help in Sierra Leone, a little country in West Africa, which I went to in the course of this book, where the rebels have been chopping off people's hands and arms and children's legs just to sow terror. There is now a peacekeeping mission there. It's an incredibly fragile situation, but that may help. You cannot help everywhere, but in some places you can. And
because you cannot help everywhere does not mean you shouldn't help somewhere.
I think that's right. You should help where you can, but it's very difficult to get it right. It's incredibly complicated. And there is another paradox also, you should consider, which I've written about in this book. What if, during the American Civil War, when Britain and France were very upset by reports of what was going on, what if there'd been CNN or television then that showed the British and the French publics the horrors of the burning of Atlanta?
War, the nature of the battles and all that?
Exactly. Yeah. And what if the British and the French had sent an expeditionary force, a peacekeeping force to the southern states? Would that have been a good thing? Sometimes
we'd have no United States of America.
Well, what would have happened? Exactly. You wouldn't have necessarily been very pleased with our benign intervention. So I think one has to be realistic that there is a downside to intervention. Perhaps you just put things into cold storage. Right. You cannot solve everybody else's problems.
A couple of points about the future. Is Europe prepared? I mean by that the respective heads of the European countries, more than some united European opinion, prepared to have the United States lead?
This is the problem. I think when the United States does not lead, Europe gets itself into a terrible mess, as we did in Bosnia.
Right.
The US wouldn't get involved in Bosnia. The French and the British tried to do it, and we messed it up. US involvement is essential, but in my view. But there is a growing feeling as Europe becomes more federalized that they can go without the United States. I think it's a terrible mistake, and I think that U.S. isolationism would be a disaster for Europe and for everybody.
But do you have some sense that there is an American isolationism underway? I mean, I don't know that there's a strong isolationist factor in the United States, a strong one. Clearly, it's always been a strain in American body politic, but I'm not sure that it is either a majority, a predominant, or even a strong.
No, I think you're right. I don't think it is, but I think it, and I hope it never becomes so, because I think U.S. involvement is essential.
Just based on all of this, and off from the premise of this book or the thesis of this book, from afar, do you think America's responsibility, because you know a lot of American journalists and like that, that foreign policy will be an issue in this campaign?
I doubt it. I mean, Kosovo is not an issue. 1 year after the bombing of Kosovo, there are articles in the papers, but it's certainly not an issue.
Increasing number of articles in criticism of Kosovo.
Yes.
And because of the way it's turned out.
I know, and it's very sad. It's very dangerous to how Kosovo has turned out. There is no peace in Kosovo yet. And this is one of the problems. Of course, we're sometimes unrealistic. We expect instant reconciliation. And to go back to the Civil War, how many decades did it take for reconciliation here in the United States after the Civil War?
Suppose someone said to you, we are actually seeing some trials at The Hague, too, which is, people forget about when you think about, the kind of violation of human rights we had. Suppose someone said to you the most important lesson of the Gulf War is that if you're going to engage in the kind of war that we did, you better finish the deal. And the same thing is true about Kosovo. We should never have allowed, at the end of that bombing, Milosevic to stand. And in the Gulf War, we should never have allowed Saddam to stand at the end. And by failing to do that, in a sense, you lose some of the impact and some of the value of what you attempted to do.
Of course that's true. On the other hand, at the end of the Gulf War, if you remember, the Bush administration put together rather skillfully a coalition of a lot of Arab countries, including the Saudis, and they made it quite clear that they would not tolerate and stay in the coalition if the United States and its allies tried to march on Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein.
But that assumes that that's what they had to do, doesn't it?
Yeah, they would have had to march on Baghdad, and it would have been
very
difficult.
I'm not sure that's true.
How do you think they could have done
I think that he might have fled.
Well, that would have been a possibility. I don't know. But it would have been. It was not within the mandate, the original mandate of the coalition to overthrow Saddam. The mandate of the coalition was to get his forces out of Kuwait. It's a great misfortune that he's still there.
Okay, sure it is. And what about Milosevic?
And Milosevic's a great misfortune too. Again, I don't think you could have, to get Milosevic out of Belgrade, you probably would have had to march on Belgrade. And one of the problems with the Kosovo war is that the United States in particular, and other NATO countries, did not wish to commit ground troops because we didn't want the casualties.
That's true. Or don't know how to find the right parties to support in order to overthrow.
Well, that's the other problem. Both in Iraq and in Belgrade in Serbia, the opposition is very weak and disunited.
Exactly. And fractionalized.
Yes.
Deliver us from evil, Peacekeepers, Warlords, in a world of endless conflict. William Shawcross, as you know, he wrote Sideshow and the Quality of Mercy. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.